In chapter 588 of One Piece, Garp says that Roger in the past could be as ferocious as a demon, but this is not the only time this gets said about Goldie Roger. There are actually several moments like this in the manga, with Roger's demonic reputation going so deep that even Ace believed that he as Roger's son carried the blood of a demon. What if this was, however, more than just the nickname the world gave the Pirate King, but was actually based on something real, something that may have happened to Roger on God Valley. And maybe Roger wasn't the only character this happened to. In chapter 708, Jin Chao says a very interesting thing about Garp, where apparently pirates in the past also viewed Garp himself as a demon. What is however very noteworthy here is the original Japanese phrasing, where Jin Chao calls Garp as an Akuma. This is a word that gets used a lot in One Piece, where Akuma is for example the devil in Devil Fruits, but there is also a more recent use of the word that is extremely relevant, where in the Elbaf arc, Akuma is the word Imu uses for his demons. It could be that Garp and Roger being both frequently referred to as demons like this is just a coincidence, but it could also be that this is actually all set up for a huge twist the story has been planning for over 15 years, and that we're finally about to see it in this flashback. The truth of what happened at God Valley could be that Garp and Roger were not the heroes of this story, but instead the villains, where Imu on this day could have turned both the hero of the Marines and the future Pirate King into his personal demons. What we were told was that Roger and Garp teamed up on God Valley to defeat the Rocks pirates, but now that we know the full context of this incident, this is very likely not the true story. It turns out that there was no logical reason for either Garp or Roger to fight Rocks during this event. Roger's reasons for coming to God Valley were to rescue Shaggy and to steal the Celestial Dragon's treasure, but he actually managed to accomplish both of these tasks at the very start of the incident, without even having to face Rocks. The Roger pirates were all ready to leave the island after they had both Shaggy and the loot, yet something kept them from escaping. Like Roger, Garp not only did not care for fighting Rocks, but he downright refused to come to the island to fight Sebek, where Kong only managed to persuade Garp after telling him that Roger was also going to be on God Valley. Despite both Roger and Garp caring so little for fighting the Rocks pirates, however, the God Valley incident was still the event when Rocks fell, where this has been confirmed by the surviving members of the crew. What I think really happened on God Valley is that after turning Roger and Garp into demons, Imu forced them to fight Rocks, and that ultimately it was Sebek who died freeing them from Imu's control. The most unexpected thing that in my opinion has so far happened in this Elbaf flashback is that while Rocks is a bad person, he is not irredeemable. Rocks D. Sebek is in truth a very grey character. In spite of him being a brutal warmonger, Sebek treats the people he respects very well. He is someone who genuinely cares about the well-being of his family and is willing to move mountains to keep his loved ones safe. Sebek has essentially with every passing chapter become a more and more sympathetic figure, to a point that I would wager that most readers have now gone from thinking of Rocks as just another villain to genuinely rooting for him. I think there could be a very specific reason why the story decided to write Sebek this way. Now that One Piece's true main villain has arrived to the scene, I think the manga could push the fans' opinion of Sebek to its absolute limit, and the final twist with Rocks D. Sebek is that he was in fact the true hero of the God Valley incident. I earlier went over that something had to happen on God Valley to make Roger stay on the island, but more specifically, something even stranger had to happen to Garp, as it genuinely looks like Garp has almost completely forgotten about the events of this day. After witnessing the aftermath of the native hunting competition, Garp cannot believe what he is seeing. Learning what the Celestial Dragons had been doing on this island shook him to his core, not only making Garp question his own sense of justice, but to also think that what he might be going through is a dream. In spite of what he saw on this island, Garp still for decades after the incident continued working for the world government, however. What is even more interesting is that Sengoku has also noted that Garp does not like to talk about what happened on this day. It could be that the reason for all of this is that Garp at God Valley was in a very literal sense not in his right mind, where Garp's mind could have been hijacked by Imu. We've now gotten a pretty good idea of how Imu's powers work on Elbaf, When Imu turns someone into a demon, the character does not just become stronger, but they basically become an entirely different person. After becoming demons, the transformation didn't just make Dory and Broggy Imu's loyal subjects, but it made them turn on everything they once stood for as proud warriors of Elbaf. Dory and Broggy were suddenly willing to attack their own crewmates, to chop down Elbaf's sacred Adam tree, and they even became gleeful at the idea of taking Yarul's head, despite just moments ago seeing him as the most respected member of their race. If Domiroverse can change someone's personality to this degree, I'd next like to entertain the idea of how it might change Garp and Roger. The way Domiroverse seems to work is that it amplifies all the evil within you, where Imu did not even have to order Dory and Broggy to start attacking their comrades, but they started doing it willingly. Domiroverse could however be far more terrifying if it happened to Garp and Roger, as the story for years has hinted that these two men possess a very dark side to them. I earlier went over how Garp and Roger have been referred to as demons throughout the story, but I think this is more than just foreshadowing for a potential future twist. I think these references actually say a lot about Roger and Garp's characters. When things get tough, Roger and Garp have shown that they can be some of the most brutal people in all of One Piece. In the past, Roger actually had an incident where he butchered all of Squardo's former pirate crew. What Roger did traumatized Squardo for the rest of his life, to a point where he years later was willing to betray Whitebeard after Akainu had pushed him on this trauma. This wasn't however an anomaly, as in the scene where Garp refers to Roger as a demon, he speaks of another event where Roger destroyed an entire nation just because someone insulted his friends. However, Garp is himself just as capable of this kind of brutality as Roger. During the Egghead arc, Garp at Hachinosu was absolutely ruthless. Seeing the island as a hive of pirates, Garp attacked Blackbeard's home like a weapon of mass destruction. He had no qualms using the pirates as living fire bombs, and took no hesitation in having to fight his former student. This is something about Garp that has become even more clear in this Elbaf flashback. When it comes to battle, Garp can turn into a berserker, where beyond just completing his mission, Garp enjoys combat for its own sake. If Imu managed to use Domiroverse on Garp and Roger, this could amplify all of these worst instincts that they have shown throughout the story. Just from what little we've already seen of their brutality, Demon Roger and Demon Garp could honestly be some of the most vicious villains we've ever seen in One Piece. I would next like to discuss a lot of the possibilities this twist would create for the story, where I think the potential for storytelling here is pretty immense. If this twist were to happen, the God Valley flashback would have the potential of becoming one of the darkest chapters in the entire series. There are dozens of Roger and Garp's comrades on God Valley, including Garp's very own son, and these characters could all be on the firing line if Roger and Garp became demons. Imu would certainly have no reservations about doing something like ordering Roger to kill his own crew, but if Dory and Broggy are any reference, Roger would not only obey, he'd actually be ecstatic about attacking the people he'd spent years sailing the seas with. The thing that really makes this theory so interesting to me, however, is the thing I alluded to before. The man who might ultimately turn Roger and Garp back to normal could also be revealed to be the man we for years thought was the true villain of God Valley. This flashback has already shown that Sebek has some of the strongest haki in the entire series. His haki is so potent that it even manages to combat Imu's special powers. When Sebek fought Garling pointed out that it took much longer than usual to regenerate from Sebek's attacks, and Sebek ultimately ended up completely dominating Garling's group, despite being outnumbered. What is also very noteworthy in this fight is that Garling had seemingly used his own version of Domiroverse on the Davy clan, yet Sebek seemingly managed to beat these demons along with Garling. While the demons created by Imu are likely much stronger than those created by Garling, this could well be set up for Sebek's haki actually being good enough to counter the powers of Domiroverse. But I also think there is an even more interesting twist of how Sebek could cancel Imu's powers. Earlier in this flashback, Sebek said that he was looking for 2 devil fruits in preparation to fight the world government. One of these was Elbaf's legendary fruit, and while the second fruit has not yet been confirmed, I honestly think the most obvious answer is the correct one, and that the other fruit Sebek wanted to have was the Yami Yami no Mi. But much more importantly, I think Sebek could already have become the user of this fruit by the time of the God Valley incident. In the timeline, there's a 6-year gap between the scene where Sebek talks about the devil fruits and the God Valley incident. This is a pretty sizable amount of time for Sebek to find the fruit he was looking for, and considering all the resources at his disposal, including things like Big Mom's Intel network, I genuinely think Sebek in 6 years could have done what it took his son over 20 years to do and got his hands on the yummy yummy no mi. The reason why the darkness fruit would make so much sense as the fruit Sebek wanted is that even beyond the obvious Blackbeard connection, we know Sebek had in the past already met Imu, but Sebek during this encounter decided that he wasn't yet ready to fight the king of the world. The reason for Sebek's hesitation could be if Imu is indeed a devil fruit user, which would mean that he is probably the most powerful and experienced devil fruit user in history, as Imu has potentially been alive for over 800 years. If Sebek realized this, and that the source of all of Imu's special abilities was ultimately still a devil fruit power, he could have thought that the best way to beat Imu would undoubtedly be with the darkness fruit, as this is the one fruit that cancels all other devil fruit powers. Whether it's with Sebek potentially at this point being the user of the yummy yummy no mi, or with him simply using the pure might of his haki, he may be the only character on God Valley with the power to truly undo Domi Reversi. And if this video's theory somehow ends up being true, Sebek could end up being the character who would stop Demon Garp and Demon Roger. Something like this happening could honestly make Rox one of the most epic characters in all of One Piece. Not only would this reveal Sebek as being strong enough to beat younger versions of Roger and Garp, even after they've been powered up by Domi Reversi, but what this twist would mean is that these two characters would essentially owe their lives to Sebek. If he ultimately was the one who returned them back to normal, the world government has already made it clear that they want Sebek dead, and if Roger and Garp were to attack him, Sebek would more than likely fight back out of pure self-defense. But I also have a bit of a bonus idea of how the story might give Sebek added motivation. As of the latest chapter, Sebek's wife, Eris, is still on God Valley, yet we know that something is going to happen to her in the future, as we know that Teach at some point in his childhood became orphaned. In case this video already wasn't dark enough, what if Roger or Garp, after being turned into demons, went as far as murdering Eris? She is not only the mother of Sebek's child, but Eris also sees herself as a full-fledged member of the Davy clan, which would make her one of the top priority targets for the government to eliminate. Honestly, I think the most interesting thing the story could do would be to have Garp kill Blackbeard's mom. Garp in the present story is being held captive by the Blackbeard pirates, and if Teach actually knew that Garp was the one who killed his mom, this could have the potential of turning Garp's imprisonment into a far more gripping, albeit also a lot more brutal storyline. If you think One Piece doing something like this with Eris might also be too much, you might be right. But we are currently in flashback territory, which means that the potential for some of the most gnarly stuff we've ever seen happening in the story actually happening on God Valley is sky high. If having to fight demons and getting his wife murdered wasn't however enough of a reason for Imu to earn Sebek's wrath, I think there is one more thing that Imu could still do to make the situation even worse for Sebek. Garp and Roger might not actually be the only characters on God Valley who Imu might turn into demons. There is a chance that this might also happen to the two characters standing side by side with Sebek at the end of this latest chapter. Just like Roger and Garp, Whitebeard and Kaido have actually also been several times referred to as demons in the story. Very notably, Whitebeard said this himself after he was stabbed by Squardo, where he used the same Akuma word that Shinchao used for Garp and that Imu uses for his demons. With Kaido, most of you are probably already aware of how often the manga has referred to him as an Oni, and this is something Kaido also believes about himself. Interestingly, Oni was also the word used for Roger when the story referred to him as a demon. The literal translation of Ace's dying words is that he believed that he carried the blood of an Oni. For another example, Oni is also the word used for Whitebeard by civilians before the start of the Summit War. There is however even more concrete evidence for Domi Reversi possibly also happening to Kaido and Whitebeard at God Valley, where just like Garp, these two do not seem to have perfect memory of the incident. I've pointed this out in my other videos, but Whitebeard and Kaido years after the incident came to view themselves as the strongest people alive. But this is actually a very strange opinion for both of them to have. If they actually remember that they faced off against Imu on God Valley. If they however turned into demons during the incident, it could explain why they do not truly remember what happened, nor that they even met Imu. Just for the sake of transparency, I should probably point out that being referred to as an Akuma, an Oni, or any kind of demon in general isn't exclusive to these characters I've used as examples in this video, and these monikers have for example also been used for some of the Straw Hats. Don't take this video to mean that this is something that has to happen. I just think that it would be a cool case of the story being interconnected. If Imu did actually use Tomi Reversi on characters who frequently being called as demons. Actually, this is a trend that has already started, where the nicknames of Dorian Brogi in Japanese are the Blue Oni and the Red Oni. There is however one interesting point I have to bring up for this video. Could Imu even do this in the first place? Turning characters like Dorian Brogi into demons is very impressive, but characters like Garp and Roger are on a whole other level and are some of the strongest people who've ever lived in this world. If Imu can turn characters as strong as these into demons, what would actually stop Imu from doing this same thing to Sebek himself? I will admit that this is also my personal biggest issue with this theory. I have only one solid argument for this, which is that unlike Sebek, I do not think Roger, Garp, or any of these other notable characters on God Valley are yet in their primes. Roger is 39 during the God Valley incident, while Garp is 40, and many of the Rocks pirates are even younger, but 40 and below is not actually the age where you stop growing stronger in One Piece. I bring this up in a lot of my videos, but the scene that proves this is Ashura Doshi in Wano, at 56 saying that he is 20 years stronger than in the past. This is consistent with everything else we've seen in the story, where prime age very clearly appears to be your 50s, or potentially even your 60s. Practically all One Piece characters who complain about growing weaker with age are actually past 70 years old. I think the only case of someone saying that they'd grown weaker earlier was Gunfall, who was 66 by the time of the Skypiea arc. I saw this point being brought up in one of King of Lightning's videos, but you can also arguably see that most of the God Valley characters are not at their peak even in this flashback, where the Conqueror's Haki clash between Roger and Whitebeard on God Valley is a lot less intense than the one they had over a decade later during their final fight. The way I see it, Sebek may very well be the only one on God Valley who is at their pinnacle, while all other characters still have years and years of growth left. It could therefore still make some sense if Imu managed to Tomi Reversi characters like young Roger and young Garp, but wasn't strong enough to do it with someone as powerful Haki as Sebek, nor could Imu possibly even do it to Roger or Garp, if they were actually in their primes. Still, I don't think this is a perfect counter-argument. Roger and Garp should both still be world beaters at God Valley, and I'd personally bet on them to beat any number of elite fighters from the current era, so Tomi Reversi working on them still has the potential of breaking the story. The idea of Roger and Garp of all characters becoming Imu's personal demons is probably very controversial to a lot of readers, but at least to me, my only real complaint is it possibly making Imu too powerful. Beyond that, I actually think this could be one of the greatest One Piece twists of all time. I honestly think it could make Roger and Garp more interesting characters by adding a genuine low point in their stories. Even though these two are legends of the One Piece world, what the story has repeatedly shown is that Roger and Garp are by no means perfect and are just as human as everyone else. The manga has arguably presented Garp like this since the start, where even in his very first scene in Kobe's cover story, Garp ends up falling asleep on a mission and allows Captain Morgan to escape. This scene essentially set the tone for Garp's character for the rest of the story, where even though he is the hero of the Marines and one of the strongest people of all time, Garp is still deeply human and just as prone to mistakes as someone like Luffy. Roger for a long time was presented very differently than Garp, where for the first 2 decades of One Piece's serialization, we only ever got a few glimpses into his character, and Roger came off as a genuine mythical figure of this world. The longer One Piece has gone on though, the more the story has started to treat Roger like Garp. In this current flashback, for example, Roger's very first scene has him making a complete fool of himself in front of Shaggy, and the flashback has just continued this trend of showcasing Roger's tomfoolery in basically every chapter. We however already knew that this is who Roger really was long before this flashback, where this side of the Pirate King was also very much present in the Oden flashback, and even before that. Characters who knew Roger always talked about how childishly adventurous he was. I personally think this is also why the Domi reversal twist could be so gut-wrenching. Roger and Garp are both in their own ways very lovable characters, so Imo turning them against everything they stood for could be horrifying. Where Roger and Garp being forced to attack their friends and family could make for some of the most heavy chapters in One Piece. While this would make the legendary God Valley incident actually be a moment of failure for Roger and Garp, I honestly think this would just make both of their characters richer. Roger and Garp are at this point in the timeline still very green, where this is still years away from their heyday. The narrator in this flashback has already noted that the two were very much in Sebek's shadow during this era, and Sengoku also says that God Valley really was just a start to both Roger and Garp's legends. I never thought about this before writing this video, but I do not think we've ever really heard of Roger's failures, unless you count stuff like him becoming sick or him coming to Laugh Tale too early. We only really ever hear about Roger's many successes. We however already know that the man wasn't perfect, and Roger likely had his own low points just like Luffy had in arcs like Sabaody and Marineford. And at least for me, something like Roger falling to Imo and having to be rescued by Sebek would only make him more interesting. I was super late on this video, where even despite the break, we're just about to see if this theory is true or not in a few days after this is uploaded. I really want this to happen, but this could also end up being the most short-lived theory I've ever made. But if you want to actually see one of my videos talking about something more distant, definitely click here to check out my mega video about the role Akainu is set up to play in the final war. Big thanks to all my victims, members, for their loot. But I actually have to give special thanks in this video to two users, Chillstone, Blake Blast, and damn, I genuinely have no idea how to rate this other username. These two users' comments are really the ones that inspired this video, so thanks a lot. I naturally appreciate everyone who watched this video to the end.